Okay, today we're going to talk about the last topic in our foldable again for the second day. We talked about quadratic formula yesterday. I'm going to go ahead and talk about a little bit of the quadratic formula. There's a part of it that has a specific name called a discriminant. So if you want to go ahead and turn to the quadratic formula tab, we're going to go ahead and discuss in a little bit more depth with the quadratic formula, some other things we know from it. Okay, so what I wrote up here is the discriminant. We see the word discriminant, which I have here. And it has special meaning in the quadratic formula. If you look down here, the discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. What's interesting about that is that that is the same thing that is underneath the radical in the quadratic formula right here. So that's what we're trying to find today. We're trying to find the number that's actually underneath the radical when you use the quadratic formula, because it has some specific meaning. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is when that number is positive, negative, or zero. So I want you to think about it for a minute. If the discriminant is a positive number, okay, if the discriminant is a positive number, you end up getting negative b, which ends up being a number, like negative 5 or positive 5. And then you got plus or minus, and then a square root of a positive number over another number. Here's the part that's important, this plus or minus. Okay, when you have a plus or minus in a problem, you have two answers. So really what I'm getting is I'm getting two answers with a positive number under a radical. So what that means is I'm going to have two positive real answers when I have a positive discriminant. So two positive real numbers, okay, real answers. And that's when I have a positive discriminant. When you get a negative number, okay, when you get a negative answer under the discriminant, or for the discriminant, you have a negative number under the radical. We've talked about it before in the past. When you have a negative under a radical, you end up getting imaginary answers. So again, I still have the plus or minus, so I'm going to get 2, okay, but now I'm going to get two imaginary answers, okay, when I have a negative under the radical. Okay, and be careful. You do get two imaginary answers, but on Math Excel, if it asks you how many real answers you have, you would say 0. If they're both imaginary, then you don't have any real ones. Okay, so again, that's if you have a negative discriminant, a negative number under the radical. The last one, if you don't have a positive and you don't have a negative, the only other number you can have under a radical is 0. Okay, so when you have 0 under the radical, the square root of 0 is 0. So even though you have a plus and a minus, you are adding 0 each time. You're adding 0 and subtracting 0, which creates the same answer twice. So in reality, if you get the same answer twice, you get one real number, okay, for an answer. You get one real number, okay, because you end up getting like 2 plus or minus 0, or 2, well, 2 plus 0 is 2, 2 minus 0 is also 2, so you would get 2 twice, which is still only one real number. So that's the third scenario when you get 0 under a radical. So let's go ahead and look at a few examples of finding the discriminant and then deciding how many answers that we're going to have. Okay, so we have two problems here. It says solve the quadratic, but we're actually just going to find the discriminant and talk about the answers. And we're only going to do that because we just worked on solving quadratics. So you can look at the other video if you're still struggling with solving the quadratic. And this problem, since all the numbers are on one side, or all the terms are on one side, I already know A, B, and C. A ends up being 9, B ends up being 12, C ends up being 4. So again, the discriminant, let me write it up here. You can find the discriminant by finding the number under the radical, which ends up being b squared minus 4ac. So in this first problem up here, your b ends up being 12, so you're trying to find 12 squared minus 4 times a times c. And I believe when you do that, your discriminant is actually 0. You get an answer of 0. So that's the number that you would put in for discriminant. Now what that means is if you don't have a number under the radical, if you have a 0, then you're going to be adding and subtracting 0 in the quadratic formula, which would mean you would get only one real answer. Okay? Because you'd end up doing plus or minus 0, which gives you the same thing back. For number 2, Okay, again, I have the same thing. I have all the terms on one side, so I already know my A is 2, and this one, my B is 16, my C is 33. Okay, so when I do B squared minus 4AC for this one, I end up getting B squared minus 4 times A times C, and if you type that in, you figure out you get -8. Okay, so yeah, -8 is my discriminant. Because it's a negative number, and that negative number would be under the radical, you have two imaginary numbers for answers. Okay, and again, what that means is you have 0 real numbers. Both are imaginary, and you don't have any real numbers. Okay, let's take a look at one more problem. Okay, for my last problem, I do need to move everything to one side of the equation for this one, so I'll do that. So I'll move the 1 over, it'll become -1. Okay, you always want 0 on one side. So I know my A is -5, my B is 8, my C is -1. So again, I'm going to go ahead and do B squared minus 4AC for my discriminant. So I end up getting B squared minus 4 times A times C. And if I type that in, let's see, I get 64 minus 20, so 44. So I would get positive 44 as my discriminant. And because it is a positive number and that number would be under the radical, that would create two real solutions. So I'd have two real numbers as solutions.